Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Jag heter Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalecinski. Mitt intresse för forskning i filmtekniska och skräcktekniker har ständigt fört mig till en av mina absoluta favoritfilmer, Stanley Kubricks The Shining. Den tillsammans med Exorcisten är kanske den mest välgjorda skräckfilmen som någonsin har gjorts. Varje film Stanley Kubrick gjorde han så välgjord att det var som om det skulle bli den allra bästa filmen i sitt slag, och han lyckades ofta. Så när han nu gjorde sin första skräckfilm var det som gällde. Det skulle bli den bästa skräckfilmen som någonsin hade gjorts. För Kubrick var det en intellektuell utmaning att forska fram hur den ultimata skrämmande filmen skulle designas. Sidospår här nu. Det kanske mest effektiva sättet att göra skräckfilm på är att göra en found footage-film som Blair Witch eller Paranormal Activity. Men Kubrick var inte intresserad av det, och där håller jag med. Dessa filmer är väldigt effektiva men innehåller väldigt lite av intresse bortom sin förmåga att just skrämmas. Kubricks motto var alltid i alla filmsammanhang: okej, det här är realistiskt, men är det intressant? Han valde alltid den intressanta, mest originella lösningen i sina filmer, även om tråkigare lösning hade varit mer realistisk. The Shining är därför en film som man kan se om och om igen och hitta nya saker i varje gång. Den är så detaljerad och hemlighetsfull att det finns ständigt nya mysterier att fundera över. Och det var kanske just detta, kombinationen med Kubricks strategiskt matematiska perfektionism, som lockade fram konspirationsteoretikerna. Så till den milda grad att det finns en hel drös halvt sinnessjuka människor som överanalyserat filmen in absurdum. Detta dokumenterades i den fruktansvärda kalkondokumentären Room 237. Jag var extremt peppad när denna till synes välproducerade dokumentär hade premiär. The Shining var verkligen en film väl värd att göra en dokumentär om. Men det visade sig att filmen endast fokuserade på de myter kring filmens innehåll som hade vuxit fram ur alla paranoida dårars hjärnor, istället för att fokusera på produktionen i sig. Att jag blev besviken är ingen överdrift. Däremot blev jag otroligt positivt överraskad när jag upptäckte Danel Olsons bok The Shining, Studies in the Horror Film. Utgiven av Centipede Press, en ultralyxig 750 sidor lång bok med allt ifrån essäer av filmexperter, intervjuer med skådespelarna och teamet bakom kameran samt Kubrick själv. Genom den framgår att samtliga konspirationsteorier bakom filmen hade ganska enkla förklaringar. Så om vi nu snabbt ska avverka de två mest kända myterna om The Shining som ältas i skitdokumentären Room 237. För det första, i Stephen Kings bok har det hemsökta rummet nummer 217 och i filmen har det oförklarligt ändrats till 237. Och där är dårarna dragit teorier om att numret syftade på allt ifrån utrotningen av judarna till avståndet till månen och månlandningen som Kubrick själv misstänks för att vara inblandad i att fejka. Anledningen var helt enkelt att ägaren till det riktiga hotellet vars utsida används i filmen, alltså insidan, byggde sin filmstudio. Diane Johnson, som skrev manuset tillsammans med Stanley Kubrick, berättade: ägaren bad helt enkelt Kubrick att han skulle ändra numret till ett högre nummer eftersom det redan fanns ett rum 217 och han var rädd för att folk skulle vägra bo i det rummet efter de hade sett filmen. Kubrick föreslog 227, men det fanns tydligen också, så då höjde han med ytterligare 10 till och det blev 237. Den andra grejen är indiankyrkogården och den berömda mjölburken med indianhuvudet bakom Mr. Halloran som skulle syfta på den amerikanska ursprungsbefolkningens utrotning. Det här var ingen välbevarad hemlighet utan det kommer direkt från Stephen Kings bok, och det finns flera indiandekorationer och gamla foton på 1800-tals järnvägsbygge över väggarna som härleder till just den tiden och detta ämne. Däremot så säger Diane Johnson att tyngdpunkten på detta är kraftigt överdriven och att det är inte filmens centrala tema. Personen jag helst skulle vilja intervjua, förutom Kubrick själv då, som numera är död, var författaren till manuset, Diane Johnson. Diane Johnson är en amerikansk romanförfattare som numera är bosatt i Paris. Diane hade vid tillfället skrivit en bok som imponerade på Stanley Kubrick, The Shadow Knows, eller The Shadow Knows som Diane vill att den ska uttalas. Kubrick ville använda Stephen Kings bok The Shining, men han tyckte förutom plottkonstruktionen att boken var slarvigt skriven och han ville införa teman och ämnen som intresserade honom i genren. Och den som man ansåg bäst lämpad för det samarbetet var inte Stephen King utan Diane Johnson. Tyvärr har jag inte kvar min kopia av The Shadow Knows, men det finns i alla fall en scen i den boken som jag är säker på att Kubrick fastnade vid. I den så låser den jagade protagonisten in sig i ett rum och hör någon viska till henne från andra sidan väggen. Telefonen ringer och en skugga uppenbaras utanför fönstret. Det låter inte så speciellt, men det är supersnyggt uppmålat och uppbyggt lager på lager i en växande subtil fasa. Det är bara en av scenerna i boken där man märker Diane Johnsons talang för att skriva spänning och mystik. I Danel Olsons bok finns en intervju gjord av Catriona MacAvoy där hon åker till Paris med Diane Johnsons anteckningar som var nedklottrade i originalmanuskriptet till The Shining, som var lånade från Stanley Kubrick-arkivet i University of the Arts i London. Hon tog med sig dessa för att utföra intervjun. Intervjun är riktigt bra och det täcker det mesta av frågorna, men jag hade fler frågor. Jag fick tag på Dianes privata mejl och skickade ett väldigt långt och seriöst mejl, men fick tyvärr inget svar. Därför vände jag mig till det näst bästa, experterna på området, Danel Olson som har skrivit boken Shining, the Studies in the Horror Film, och Catriona MacAvoy gjorde intervjun med Diane Johnson. Catriona har även, kan man säga, doktorerat i Stanley Kubrick. I have one thing that I'm curious about. The theme of eyes is an ongoing one in Kubrick's films, A Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, and also in The Shining. Diane Johnson says in an interview that one of the things that she and Kubrick talked about was why eyes was scary. But they also talked about Freud's essay, The Uncanny, unheimlich in German. And according to that, the loss of eyes is equal to castration and the whole Oedipus complex thing, which I find kind of old-fashioned today and not very interesting. So, was it about that, or was it another type of discussion about what makes eyes scary?
Their entire approach was very intertextual. And I think that they, in discussion with Diane and looking through the archives, it seems that they created a framework for the film that was based around the concepts of the uncanny and Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment, the unheimlich. I mean, and that is a big part of Freud's essay on the uncanny. There's the story about the doll maker, the boy who has the phobia about his eyes being plucked out. And, so that's one of the main, I think there's sort of 3 stories, I think, if I can remember rightly, that he goes into in his discussion of the uncanny. The literal translation of unheimlich, unhomely, so obviously the home, a hotel, is kind of a unhomely place. So you're already starting in a place that feels familiar, but yet is uncanny, is not quite comfortable. And I think that really the use of the uncanny was to create that sense, and actually in a very Lovecraft sort of way, isn't it? To create a sense of things not quite being not quite right.
That's funny. Kubrick actually quotes Lovecraft, and I quote Kubrick here. I read an essay by the great master H.P. Lovecraft where he said that you should never attempt to explain what happens as long as what happens stimulate people's imagination, their sense of the uncanny, their sense of anxiety and fear, and as long as it doesn't within itself have any obvious inner contradictions, it's just a matter of, as it were, building on the imagination. Working in this area of feeling, I think also that the ingeniousness of a story like this is something which the audience ultimately enjoys. They obviously wonder as the story goes on what's going to happen. And there's a great satisfaction when it's all over and not having been able to anticipate the major development of the story, and yet, at the story's end, to feel that you have not been fooled or swindled.
He was trying to get right to the core of our fear by drawing on psychoanalysis.
Danel Olson.
Of course, in The Uncanny, what Freud talks about in that short essay, he gets very interested in eyes and loss of eyes, non-recognition of our own eyes when we look in a mirror. And he talks about, of course, that story, The Sandman, and the issue of plucking out eyes. in the next book that I have coming out, the short works, the short stories, criticism, essays, and introductions of Patrick McGrath. It's called Writing Madness, named after his essay of being the son of the longest serving medical superintendent at Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum in London, near London, west of London. In this book, he talks about eyes as well. He talks about a case in the asylum of a woman who had managed to, one of the patients at Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum, which is still in business, it's called Broadmoor Hospital now, which houses some people who've committed violence and are also mentally disturbed. He mentions a case as a kid that he remembers acutely, and it deals with eyes, and I can sew it up to my idea. He says a woman at Broadmoor manages to steal a spoon that night from supper, takes a spoon. They discover her in the morning. She's not making any sound, but the staff come into her room and they see blood at the edge of her sheets, the top edge of her sheet. They pull the sheets down. There she is. She's alive, but in the night she has scooped out her eyes with that spoon, this schizophrenic woman. And nobody hears it in the night. And this is what Patrick McGrath meditates on in his essay, the power of the mind to hold in or hide suffering, to commit an act like that, but also not to scream, not to cry, not to yell out. The eyes are always connected with recognition, one of our foremost senses of taking in material. The loss of the eyes is what we experience in many a weird story, horror story, haunted story, or ghost story. And that is this dread. I no longer have my senses to guide me. I'm in a strange and unaccountable place, and I can't tell what's coming at me next. To me, that is the most interesting aspect of the eyes, rather than, as you mentioned, as Freud dwells on, and as maybe the world is somewhat tired of, the idea of castration and so on. I'm more interested in it as that primal loss of our best sense. What is to guide me now if I can't see? Now, in a book like The Shining, what's really fascinating is when you look in characters' eyes and they seem vacant. There's a magic moment where Shelley Duvall, as Mrs. Torrance, Wendy Torrance, looks at her son, and of course, you see the little finger come out, and Tony tells her that, Danny isn't here anymore, and the blankness in Danny's eyes is dazzling. The intensity in Torrance's eye, Mr. Torrance's eyes, Jack Torrance's eyes, as the movie goes on, that sense of I'm on a mission, and it's bringing me pleasure in executing it. Look at his eyes after he kills Scatman Crothers with that axe. There's a kind of intoxication. Look at his eyes, for instance, when he meets with the naked woman in the tub, Leah Beldam, that actress who we interview. Our man Justin Bozen tracked this wonderful lady down. She's amazing, and got a good interview with her. And Jack's eyes, Nicholson, this with these magic eyebrows, this absolute sense of lovely seduction in the eyes, and then ghastly surprise as he looks in the mirror. The eyes as both revealing horror and also projecting horror when the eyes are blank, or the eyes are, what you say, canine, focused, wolf-like, going after the victims. And somebody sees that. Wendy sees that. I think that's why the eyes are so important, for those two reasons. One, you lose them, and how will you get out of this nightmare? How will you survive? How can you deal with the monsters that be? And two, that sense that you see a family member in this haunted hotel, snowbound, and they're not who they were anymore. And the eyes are the quickest sense, the quickest beacon. That's the lighthouse that's telling you right off.
Well, Kubrick creates the uncanny with the eyes by having Jack Torrance look into or just above the camera lens for a long, long take without blinking.
It's a subtle way to bring an uncanny sense to us. Show us an actor who doesn't blink in 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 50 seconds, and we are unconsciously picking up something's very abnormal here. That person isn't like you or me anymore. He's somewhere else now.
My research into the film has been almost wholly about Kubrick and Diane Johnson, what they talked about when they were researching and writing the script. What books and themes were discussed? And apparently it was Kubrick's interest in ESP and the effect and use of fairy tales. Books like Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment.
Excellent book, all about fairy tales and psychoanalysis. Those two texts created a psychoanalytic framework that then they were able to weave in things that touch on our fears, culturally, the things that frighten us, about ghosts and about, so there were other things that they then were able to weave in to that framework that resonate with fairy tales. So from Red Riding Hood, again, you've got the innocent child is kind of fooled by the wolf-like character. The grandmother turns into a wolf. There's that kind of doppelganger kind of thing about who do you trust? I mean, and in The Shining, we see Jack become very wolf-like, doesn't he? He's overtaken by the hotel. And then you can also see Snow White in there, which is perhaps more relates to the original book. But the moment where Jack sets the drink in the bar is like the poison apple from Snow White. It's that moment, the moment of his downfall, really, where he turns to the dark side. So it's in the book, it relates more to the scrapbook from Stephen King's book, which is the poison apple moment, as Diane Johnson explained to me. And then also, obviously, that's a Faustian pact that's made as well. So it relates to that story as well. And the other fairy tale that you see it relate to is Pinocchio. Danny as Pinocchio. Danny's journey and his learning about himself and learning about his powers and his abilities. Kubrick's copy of The Uses of Enchantment is actually in the archive. So you can see in the archive, you can actually see passages that he's underlined and bits that particularly interested him. And it was those particular stories. It was Red Riding Hood and Pinocchio. Other books that he used, for research for The Shining include, as I mentioned before, Faust. So you're seeing there that kind of the dark side, that the duality in that journey, and also Steppenwolf, which is very much a story of a man who leads a parallel life.
The Gothic novel The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis, written in the year 1796.
Diane Johnson and I, we discussed the use of some of the classic Gothic literature in the film. And The Monk was one of the stories that she mentioned. And we discussed that it was, it related to the fact that in the story, the monk goes into a trance, does things that he then later, horrible things that he then later regrets. And, Jack's character, the same sort of thing happens. He does terrible things to his family whilst he's kind of overtaken by the hotel and the spirits of the hotel.
Well, one of the things that Kubrick said was that for him, the film was about the destruction of the family.
They agreed that that is what the story was actually about.
Diane Johnson also talks about a scene that was shot but ultimately cut from the final version of the film. That scene involved a scrapbook that had a very important role to play in the film. So, what was in that scrapbook and what was its purpose?
Yeah, and actually the scrapbook prop, it does exist in the archive, and it's a amazing document that the pre-production spent a lot of time creating newspaper articles and putting them into this scrapbook and creating a kind of false history of the hotel. And this is actually in the Kubrick archive now, and you can look at this prop. So it was from the original, from the King story, that Jack finds this scrapbook in the boiler room. And within the scrapbook is the horrible history of the hotel. So it's newspaper cuttings telling stories of, all the awful things that have happened in the area, from the story of the Donner party and the cannibalism that Jack mentions to Danny and Wendy when they're in the car on the way up to the hotel. From that early terrible story right through to, lots of scandals and things that happened related to the hotel. And obviously then the tragic story of the Grady family as well, and the grisly murders that happened at the hotel. So the scrapbook contained that information. Diane Johnson said she saw the scrapbook as the poison apple. She saw this as the moment when Jack finds the scrapbook. That is when the hotel and its evil takes over Jack. So she thought that that was something that was missing from the film. What we see of the scrapbook in the film is the first scene when Jack is supposed to be typing, working on his typewriter, and he's actually fallen asleep and he's having a nightmare. We see in the shot the scrapbook is on the table next to him, and that's the only little hint of the scrapbook that is left within the film. There were actually quite a lot of scenes with the scrapbook that were shot. There was a scene where Jack's looking through the scrapbook. Wendy comes into the room and he starts telling her some of these stories that are in the scrapbook and about the history of the hotel. So these scenes were filmed, but they ended up on the cutting room floor. I think Kubrick probably thought that, it was too, I think he preferred his storytelling to be a bit more subtle. He probably thought it was unnecessary to have that kind of exposition.
In an early draft of the script, it ends with Wendy killing Jack in the kitchen with a knife, and Halloran is revealed to be a killer too, and he chases Danny around the hotel until Wendy kills him in a violent frenzy to save her son. And in doing so, she becomes a mass murderer herself. There is another version of an ending that was actually shot. It comes right after the 1921 photograph of Jack.
That was an exciting thing for many of the readers of this book. They didn't know that originally, Memorial Day 1980, when the film is shown in New York, there was an added 10 to 15 minutes that most people have never seen. And the decision Kubrick made was, that ending is too pat. That gives away too much information. We need to cut it. And so we have the ending we have now, the still picture of the July 4th ball. I asked different people why this was. We didn't have Kubrick alive to answer, but I asked his the director's assistant, Leon Vitali. This is page 503, and I said, well, I want to see that original ending.
Unfortunately, it's impossible to see any of the cut scenes from Kubrick's films because he had everything on the cutting room floor incinerated. Nothing would remain of his trials and errors. The finished film would be it. I guess Kubrick would be horrified by all the DVD extras available today. I guess that would be exactly what he wanted to avoid.
I was able to see frames of it by going to the Stanley Kubrick archive at the University of Arts in London. You can see some frames of it, and we show one frame of it in this book. The manager of the hotel go to the hospital, visit with Mrs. Torrance. On the way, he sees the boy Danny in the hallway, says hello. He goes in and he tells Wendy Torrance, look, I've got a place in Florida. You know, it's big. You can stay there. You can recover. You've been through so much. And consider that. And of course, this is a woman with no options. She's suffered through so much. And she said, yes, this is so kind. I'd like to do that. And as the manager leaves the room and enters into the hallway where Danny's playing, he takes out a tennis ball, and you know he rolls it over toward Danny with the expression that we'll see you again soon. And of course, Danny's freaked out by this because it recalls that scene from The Shining where these tennis ball comes out of nowhere and you think it's from the twins.
Well, it's a really obvious ending, and understand why Kubrick went for a subtler ending. As it is now, ending on the photograph of Jack on the 1921 ball. I mean, we still get the point. Evil has always been there and probably always will be. Kubrick says something interesting, and I quote here from Danel's book. We wanted the hotel to look authentic rather than the traditionally spooky house. The hotel's labyrinthine layout and huge rooms, I believed, would alone provide an eerie enough atmosphere. This realistic approach was also followed in the lighting and in every aspect of the decor. It seemed to me that the perfect guide for this approach would be found in Kafka's writing style. His stories are fantastic and allegorical, but his writing is simple, straightforward, almost journalistic. On the other hand, all the films that are made of his work seem to have ignored this completely.
He also said, I want to go against all the formulas that I've ever seen for those kinds of films. And this is where I think his genius is. He fights formula, he fights the tradition, he gives what's unprecedented, and yet he's successful at it. For instance, we can look at The Shining. It's a non-typical horror movie. It doesn't have the rising arc that most horror movies have. It's a haunted hotel, but this hotel is not decrepit. It's not falling apart. It's not dark all the time. Many horror movies up to this point take place much of the time in darkness, so our sense of sight is really limited. Our number one sense just can't be depended on. And this film, instead, Kubrick told his lighting people, I want X thousand lights streaming into these windows. I want it bright, like you get at your latitudes when you go way up north to Sweden. In the wintertime, there's this kind of, when the sun does come out, this kind of blinding brightness that we won't get down in Texas, in these high northern latitudes. I want that. Now, that was almost unseen in a horror movie, that it would be lit up much of the time, bright as can be. You remember the scullery or the kitchen scenes in The Shining, how bright they are, and that the lobby scenes, and then the typing room can be very bright at times. That was very unusual, and there he was, pushing it, going right into the opposite of what a horror movie is, that the ghosts could come out in daytime, that you could be having these sorts of encounters in the brightest of light, had to be shocking to audiences for the first time.
And Kubrick also says in an interview that all the accounts of people seeing ghosts, the ghosts have been described as being as solid and realistic as someone just standing there in the room, unlike the classic horror movie cliché of the see-through ghost. So Kubrick's film was naturally lit, and the ghosts appear as solid as any human being in bright lit rooms or daylight.
Along with this technique, this is probably the first film where the Steadicam was employed throughout much of the film. There were a couple exceptions. It was done in Rocky by the same camera operator, Garrett Brown, who I interview in the book, and it was done in Marathon Man a little bit. But in The Shining, our man Kubrick said, let's take this technology of following a subject, whether the subject's on a big wheel, that trike going down the carpet, or running in the hallway or going up the steps. Let's exploit this new technology. He did, and it had to astound audiences at the time. For you and me, we're a bit younger. So we have grown up with seeing the Steadicam used all the time. But when Danny goes down the hallways and his trike, and somehow that camera's able to follow him and make fast turns, which you could never get with the typical dolly arrangement on that little track that cameras would run on, it had to jolt audiences. They'd never seen anything like that. So what I respect about him more than anything is the desire to use new technology in his film, to bank on that new technology, but second, to undercut all the previous ideas of what this genre should give us, or how it should send out its signal. He subverts all of those and does it in a fresh way. And that's why I think people were down on this movie when it came out. Thought it just didn't satisfy as a horror film. But I think time has shown us that it satisfies on a deeper level than most of the horror films before it. An unsolved puzzle, ever-existing mystery, it's a thorn in the heart. You're never over it. Just like a great poem that's ambiguous, that's whose ending could be read 3 or 4 or 5 ways, never really leaves you. A poem that's conclusive is forgotten the next day. And I think that's why people love The Shining. My students, even though Shining came out in 1980, and my students were born around year 2000 or 1998, they love it because there is a maze. There is a boy in a maze who's trying to outwit his father, and if he can successfully backtrack, then he'll live. But if he can't, then the big bad wolf will get him. It's the ultimate and primal storytelling. Someone is after you, stronger, armed, and insane. No boundaries. They will do anything to you. Are you going to get away or not? To me, that's the kind of story that never goes away. I think it appeals to people of every age.
The idea of the doppelganger is something that fascinated Kubrick, and also Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, that is, neglect of the dark side of our personality, something that he explored more fully in his next film, Full Metal Jacket. Can you talk about the use of mirrors in the film? Both Danny and Jack are at multiple times talking while looking at themselves in a mirror.
Again, that you can link that to the Freudian idea of the doppelganger. And you could say that, that the deliberate use of mirrors highlights that duality.
Well, Red Rum is written in reverse, and it's revealed through the mirror to spell murder. Do you think this could be applied to the characters as well? I mean, that the mirror represents their true self speaking.
I don't know if it's necessarily about mirroring, seeing the truth, but I think it highlights duality. I think Kubrick's point was, looking at this idea that we all have within us, the capacity to be two different people.
Another thing that Kubrick was really fascinated, he said he was interested in ESP, but more specifically, possession by the dead.
I got very interested in this idea that we can get possessed by the ones that leave us behind, that die. And I did work in Alexandra Adler, the daughter of the behavioralist Adler, and another psychiatrist named Lindemann did on disasters. There was a famous nightclub fire in 1942 in America. They did a big study on the survivors, one of the first studies of psychological effect of trauma on survivors. And they found that many of these survivors felt possessed by the dead one. And they were dressing, talking, even styling their hair like the dead one. And this got me looking around at other cultures where this happens. And I applied my trauma gothic reading to 4 novels that deal with the terrorist attack on the towers. And that is the thing, I think, that's not really been plumbed yet. We haven't gotten to the depths with The Shining and that whole idea of where is this communication coming to Jack from? That's one of the eeriest parts of the book. Grady, he meets Grady in the bathroom, of course, but he tells Grady, no, you're the caretaker. Grady tells him, no, you've always been the caretaker here. To me, that's the most fascinating part of the film, how somebody starts becoming convinced that I'm not who I am anymore, I'm somebody else. Because it shows you how slippery personality is, how tentative a thing is a persona. how fragile and breakable it is, and how we could become someone else. I think writers love becoming for a while someone else, and so do actors, and so do directors. They love to shed the burden of who we are and take the burden of someone else for a while, even if it's a killer. At least it's somebody else, right? Take me away from the boredom of being myself.
What interested you when you started researching this film? What were you most keen on finding out?
The first thing I looked at was the relationship with Saul Bass and the process of creating the design and artwork for The Shining.
For those who doesn't know, Saul Bass was an American graphic designer and a filmmaker, best known for the title sequences in the famous Otto Preminger film The Man with the Golden Arm and Hitchcock's North by Northwest. Saul Bass also drew a very famous portrait of Bob Dylan, and he has also designed the logo for the Brooklyn Bear.
The reason I was so interested in this was because in the archive there are 300 plus sketches from Saul Bass that were sort of sent back and forth between him and Kubrick during that process to end up with the logo on the original posters, which is sort of a face kind of. And so that was one of the first things that I found really, really interesting. Whilst Kubrick was still working on the script with Diane Johnson, he was already thinking about the marketing and distribution, even, you know, in the very early stages of pre-production. It was a good job that he did, because it took them right up until, you know, a couple of years till the film was finished, till they actually were happy with what he'd sent through. So he wanted the emphasis to be on, there's one letter that points out that this is a film of terror and the supernatural, Kubrick says to Bass in a letter. And after he'd received sort of, maybe 200 drawings, Kubrick sent a letter to Saul Bass saying, I really like the designs, none of them are quite right. What happened to that first one you showed me back in London? So after he'd done, you know, like 200 drawings, he still wanted to go back to the first one that he'd shown him. So I think the idea was always quite strongly in Kubrick's mind, the impact that he wanted to have with the film and with the marketing. It was just that he wanted to exhaust all of the options before he made a decision.
Did you ask any of the interview subjects that worked on the film about the conspiracy theories that were circling around?
We asked some of the cast and crew about the theories, you know, the 5 or 6 conspiracies of the day, and all of them said, no, it's absolutely not about that.
Finally, let's have Kubrick's own view on the meaning of the film from one of the few taped interviews he made with French Michel Simet. The sound quality is unfortunately terrible, so listen carefully.
Reason doesn't help you. You're in an area where, as I say, it's more like music, you know, than rational thought. You know, there are areas where rationality can take you up to the border, and from there on it's poetical or musical or imaginative. I think with this type of story, if you try to be verbally analytical, it becomes slightly ridiculous. Either you make too much of it, or you reduce it to some sort of ultra-clear absurdity. And I think the musical or poetic sort of manipulation of the material is the most important thing.
So, Kubrick's point, as it was way back with his film 2001, that although in the making of it he attacked the film from an intellectual perspective, the finished film was always meant to evoke an emotional response in the viewer, like a piece of music. I think I made too much out of my analysis and why certain themes were applied, like the fairy tale aspect. The way I understand it, they used aspects of the fairy tale to the point that people would subconsciously feel that there was something familiar about the story and events that unfolded in the film. The good thing about reading Danel Olson's book and talking to him and Catriona has been that I've finally killed all the questions I had about the hidden meanings of the film and Kubrick's intention. My conclusion is that even though Kubrick was a notorious perfectionist, I had overestimated him and his intentions. But it felt good. It felt good that my curiosity was satisfied. Och med de orden var det slut för den här gången. Jag heter Henrik Möller och musiken är skriven av Testbild. Hej då!